Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hey there, and welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for coming along and listening to this show that we designed as a way that you have a resource if you work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show with Craig Brown. Craig is an industry veteran and a former PLM leader at General Motors. Hey, Craig, how are you today?
I'm great, Tom. It's good to hear your voice again.
Good to hear yours. We've been doing a lot of these shows lately. I think the listeners are in store for some really, really good information.
Yeah, today we're going to talk a bit about how mass production of a particular kind of product, how they converted to going more digital. And I've heard this presenter at a couple conferences, and I think there's some interesting insights. So I hope everybody also agrees with that.
Yeah, it looks like she's got some good stuff to say. And every single week, Craig and I try to bring to this podcast really interesting interviews and other ideas that will help all of the listeners enhance and grow their careers. And today we're going to live up to that. Today we have Susanne Lauda, and she is the Director of Global Advanced Manufacturing Technology at AGCO Corporation. Corporation. And Susanne, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're glad you're here. So could you please tell us a little bit about your background in this field, sort of how you got started and what you do now?
Yes, absolutely. So as you probably can hear from my accent, I'm from the South. I'm from the Atlanta area, Georgia. No, just kidding. I'm from the south of Germany originally. And many years ago, I basically had my first contact with U.S. manufacturing when I was supervising some production issues that we had for structural parts for the Space Shuttle. And those parts were manufactured in the Mojave Desert in California. And I liked California so much that I decided I wanted to stay in the United States. And then I pursued a few more career opportunities in the United States. I was dealing with heavy castings, iron castings, hydraulic presses, importing equipment from Germany. So I did quite a lot of things in the United States, all around manufacturing. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I was hired by AGCO Corporation for the introduction of product lifecycle management throughout the manufacturing sites.
Interesting. So you and I have almost same timing. I was been at GM for a long time, but I went from different areas into the PLM responsibilities. So, Susanne, I heard you speak at least at the PIPLMX event last fall, and what I found interesting about your presentation is the success you've had at AGCO about the title of your presentation was Lean and Smart Manufacturing. And I just wondered if you could summarize for the listeners who weren't with us at the conference, what's the main conclusion of all that?
Sure. So when you look at what's out in the market from AGVs, 3D printings, drones, you name it, everything looks extremely attractive. It's basically the new and shiny thing in the shelf. However, it's always a bit of an investment, and companies should not make such an investment or jump into something just because it is cool or new or trendy. You have to evaluate your processes first. You have to see where you have needs for improvements. And we always work on continuously improving our processes. And when there is a good fit for one of these fantastic new opportunities, then we pursue it and then we try it out and see if it drives value for us. And if it does, then it gets officially introduced.
Well, now they recruited you to help with product lifecycle management. Was this new to them, or is it you were replacing somebody who retired?
No, it was no. Yes and no. So it was not exactly new at this point. When I was hired, AGCO had already what they thought was PLM, but it really was PDM. So basically, they had already a good repository for engineering data, but it stopped basically there. And the name PLM says Product Lifecycle Management.
Right.
And this means it cannot just be housed in engineering. It has to be continued into the manufacturing environment. From there, it has to go into the after sales, and then it has to feed back into the engineering, into the conceptual studies in engineering. So it has to be, so PLM, in my opinion, is a little bit of an old-fashioned terminology for what I would call today a digital thread.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes it's interesting to talk about, well, where did the thread start? You know, some companies are motivated by manufacturing efficiency, and some are motivated by all their engineers working in one systems. How about for you? What's your experience? Is there a right way to start the thread, or does the thread start at either end?
The right way to start it is to start it jointly, in my opinion. It's the easiest way, but in one way, from a technology perspective and process perspective, it's probably the easiest way to start it jointly. From a human perspective, it's probably the most difficult one, because companies are still siloed, and everybody is working on their own little solution and very proud of their own little solution. And to me, it really doesn't matter so much where to start and who should start it, as long as you start it and expand it.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. Was there a single champion, a senior executive over both manufacturing engineering or manufacturing planning and engineering, or were there just a partnership between two executives that made it happen?
Our senior vice president manufacturing, he is a true champion. He really, really drove this forward. And to me, it was always fantastic, and still is fantastic working with him, because he is very visionary.
Okay. So it does help to have that single responsible person, and in this case, it came from manufacturing. I found it a lot of them. I've been into plants, but it's never had a responsibility to manage a plant or improvements in the plant. And I was always surprised how us guys from engineering would show up, and folks from manufacturing had already figured it out. Right? It was a very humbling experience. In your title, you also say smart manufacturing. What are the hallmarks or the characteristics of smart manufacturing?
So smart manufacturing is basically making use of those possibilities that I had mentioned earlier. The AGVs that are basically autonomous these days, 3D printing, everything that is under this cover of fourth industrial revolution. That is what I would probably consider. And again, as I said, smart is only smart if it helps you to improve your processes. And there's one very important aspect that I probably mention in every single presentation. If you do not get your backbone, your digital thread through the PLM system right, if you don't get your data clean, all of these other devices, they don't help you much. If you print the wrong part on your 3D printer because you don't have the right part number, it's not helping you. If you have an AGV that goes to the wrong station because the bill of process was incorrect, it's not helping you. So it's very important that you do your homework first, that you have a solid backbone. And then, to me, those AGVs, the drones, the cobots, they are the ribcage attached to it.
Yeah, that's excellent. So did you have resistance as you were trying to do these new things? If so, how did you handle it?
Of course, there is always resistance because, especially in manufacturing, you find a lot of people that, for a good reason, are very conservative because they have 20, 30 years experience. it has worked well the way they did it for 20 years. How they did it for 30 years. It's very difficult to convince them to try new processes, because introducing a new tool is ultimately also introducing a new process. Somebody once told me, don't automate stupid. I'm not saying that the old processes are stupid, but they were basically defined 20 years ago, 10 years ago, not knowing what opportunities we have with today's technology. So the openness to change the processes has to be there, and that is sometimes an issue. And how to overcome it, you have to, first of all, make sure that they understand that we don't want to wreck their plant, because they have, of course, pride and responsibility for a plant. And the first thing we have to ensure that we are not wrecking the plant and make them part of the solution. And the way to do this is basically do smaller isolated pilots, engage them into those smaller pilots, and make sure that those pilots don't shut an entire plant down in case something goes wrong in those pilots. That is the way we address it.
Yeah, and that's I think all big industrial manufacturers do just that. It's in small steps. It sometimes the theorist or the idealist thinks it should go a lot faster, and what they got to remember is we're very conservative about messing up what we currently do really well, right? And
exactly,
it'd be a lot easier if we were a startup, because then we wouldn't have to worry about that. But because we don't have any track record to worry about poisoning or causing trouble with. So okay, so you're going down the road to more digital. You had a phrase, I think it's your company phrase, about design anywhere, build anywhere.
Yes.
What have you learned along that journey that surprised you, as it would expect product lifecycle management?
So the design anywhere, build anywhere is basically what automotive does in their platform strategy. And the design anywhere is not quite as complicated, because as long as you stay within your CAD system and your EBOM, you are not moving physical part. But as soon as you carry this build anywhere, and let's not forget the service anywhere, as soon as you start carrying it into these new environments, then you are really dealing with physical restrictions sometimes. So if you want to build the same type, in our case, tractor or combine, at two different plants that are totally different number of workstations, total different layout, total different skill set of workers, then it becomes more challenging. I would not say it was a surprise. It was expected. And it's almost fun to overcome those challenges.
Well, that's great. That's interesting, because I think this is one of the things that people discount. They come up with the best way of doing something, and they automatically assume that it would roll out everywhere. And you mentioned the skills of the workforce. I mean, that sometimes is way underestimated, that you might have to change your manufacturing work instructions just based upon the skill of the local plant. It makes sense when you say it, but it's interesting to me how oftentimes people forget that, and it ends up being a hurdle. And of course, upper management probably expected the PLM team to predict that problem and manage around it. So
right.
So we all use different vendors. Where I came from at General Motors, we were pretty adamant on one around the globe wherever we engineered. What about at AGCO? Is there things you prefer about the solution providers, or things you wish they would do better?
We have a multi-system PLM, so we have not just one provider. And
why did you do that? I mean, maybe it's where you came from, or who you acquired.
Well, no, we basically looked at best of breed for what we need in certain sectors most. And so that's how we selected them. And I mean, if you look at what IoT means connect systems, right? So I'm not that nervous, or we are not that nervous about connecting systems, because in the future you will connect even more systems, and you will collect data out of numerous systems, and you have to interpret them. So what I would like to see is more standardized and open interfaces. That would make life a lot easier.
Yeah, so there's a group of folks, they're in the aerospace and defense industry, but they are adamant about this interoperability, and they are pushing quite strongly for that. They would like companies like yours and where I retired from, and car companies, to join them. You might want to look for that. It's interoperability standards. You'll find it. Boeing and a few others are the champions behind it. But yeah, solution providers are not doing that on their own, and some are better than others. But it's probably going to take the industry giants, which would include yourselves, to help push that down the road.
Yeah, of course. Now, I mean, they are protective of their systems, right? And the ones that were originally strong in engineering, they are expanding more into manufacturing. The ones that were originally strong in manufacturing expand more into engineering. The ones that were originally ERP are suddenly also more MES vendors. So they are all trying to expand, and in an effort to expand, they are getting more protective.
Yeah, which is exactly the opposite of what we want.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk one last step about the workforce transition. So I'm thinking of folks on the line who maybe are used to using 2D drawings, and you show up and say, well, here, I got a tablet for you, and you can interact with the model, and you can query it and give us all these other things. Do you ever get the response, I just need the drawing and those key dimensions. That's all I want to see. And how do you convince them it's time to consider something better?
Yeah, of course, this is something that happens quite frequently. So they are like, oh my God, cannot write something down here. I need to take my personal notes. And then I'm like, no, don't write your personal notes on a piece of paper, because we as a company need your personal notes.
Yeah, we need the insight, right?
Exactly. We cannot rely on tribal knowledge and of a piece of paper that's somewhere in your back pocket. We as a company need to have the same level of information. So what we did is actually our work instructions are so-called electronic work instructions. So they are created right out of the bill of process. So we have EBOM, MBOM, bill of process, and then electronic work instructions. The first advantage of this is that they are change controlled, because what this person has in the back pocket on a piece of paper is not change controlled. So having this change controlled work instruction is very important. And so that was the first stage. In the second stage, now we made those electronic work instructions interactive. So they are basically part of our CM2 process. I don't know if you're familiar with the CM2, but it's an industry standard that we are using.
Yeah, and there are people on the audience that probably are familiar. There are probably people that are not. So go ahead and elaborate a little bit.
So CM2 is basically, it's a configuration management tool. It's owned by the Institute of Process Excellence, and they give you very good guidelines for a closed loop change process through all your digital thread, basically, from the ideation all the way to the service and back. And it describes very clearly what you have to do and how you have to document it. And part of this documentation is that if a worker sees something on a work instruction where he or she thinks that something needs to be updated, this worker can already enter a problem report or a change request at the workstation, and it is electronically fed back to the owner of that work instruction.
Yeah, and that's maybe that's one of the biggest benefits of all of this digitization, is the fact that you can tie all this together almost interactively and still have a rigorous change control and configuration management. We've had Joe on one of our earliest podcasts, and what I find interesting about the IPX guys is just that they've gone from kind of focused on the defense industry their first few decades, and now with Joe and others joining them, it's kind of combining what we do in real mass production, which is what you guys and us guys did at GM, right? And
exactly.
and the defense industry practices around configuration management. the two of those combined, I mean, I don't know how a company that's competitive can do without those anymore. And I guess that person that's resistant on the line, sometimes they don't want to share that tribal knowledge, right? But are there any folks you just can't convince, or do they basically get old and retire?
There's always somebody you can absolutely not convince, but
so what do you do with them? Do you make them the PLM steward or something, or
ideally you would actually get them on your side, but this is not always possible. So in that case, you may have to move them to a workstation where their resistance doesn't have that much of an impact, for instance.
Right.
That would be a very logical solution.
So that was an excellent summary. And part of what we're here about the Digital Enterprise Society is to talk about accepting the fact that these things are coming. There's this whole Industrial Revolution 4.0, which you touched on. I think you even mentioned at the beginning, drones. Did I hear you right? Do you use drones to fly around your factory and take pictures? I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, never mind. Don't go further. That's interesting for another day. It's interesting that you have big enough factories. This is what people should remember. And the drones can help you manage probably seeing where your material's flowing or things like that. So it's really interesting. But the other thing we want to encourage is there's lots of us that are different places in our careers. And some of our listeners are just coming out of college, or they're into their first decade of work. And what kind of advice would you have for them? You have an interesting background. You started from southern Germany. I thought that was Bavarian, by the way.
One state over, Baden-Württemberg, but very close to that.
Well, now you got to teach. Now you and I are going to have to teach geography for southern Germany. But anyways. What would you say to somebody who's in their late 20s, early 30s, and they're wondering about this whole digital enterprise stuff, or the Industry Revolution 4.0? Are they ahead of the curve, behind the curve? What should they do to stay connected with where we're going with PLM?
So that their advantage is that they are digitally educated, which I, for instance, when I started my career, I was not. So they have that huge advantage of having no fear of digital systems. Mm-hmm. What they are lacking, obviously, is the experience. So to me, it's always important to have somebody who is very experienced together with somebody that has those skill sets. That makes the perfect team. In general, I'm always a little bit concerned how we can interest those young people with that digital skill set that we need so badly. How can we make them interested in our manufacturing industry? Because all they want to do is work for a Google or an Amazon or whatnot. And they may not want to build tractors because they think it's not attractive. They have to understand that if they are working for us, they are actually working with those systems, and they are also working with those companies and helping those companies shape their products to our demands. So it's actually, in my opinion, more attractive to work for an end user such as us than for a company that basically is just a provider.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's why I made my choices the way I did. So, Thom, back to you.
Thanks, Craig. Hey, Susanne, before we let you go, in listening to your background and the successes that you've had throughout your career, one of the things I'm picking up in is that you've never been shy to help drive change. And as we talk about those younger workers that we were just speaking to, and we talk about sort of workforce transitions that are happening, how can someone who's a little bit younger step up and help drive change in their company?
I can only speak from my personal experience, and that was, don't be shy. Always say what you see is not the best way to do it. Always be brave, mention your suggestions, and then you will get heard, and then sooner or later you will be on the right career path.
Awesome advice. Any last words for the audience?
Not for me, Tom. I'm all set. And Susanna, it's been really interesting chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us here. You know, every single week we bring more interviews, more thoughts, more ideas to those of you who sit here and participate as part of our Digital Enterprise Society podcast family. So make sure that every single week you're downloading the episodes, you're listening to them, and then share them with your coworkers and your friends. Remember, the Digital Enterprise Society, it is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.